Welcome to the American Academy of Grief Counseling's Videogram on war, suffering, and loss. And in previous videos, we have discussed ideas regarding traumatic grief and how it totally destroys the individual. It is such a obscene, traumatic, uh, detrimental, catastrophic, apocalyptic type of loss that the whole human psyche is almost utterly destroyed by what it is witnessing. And war presents this type of traumatic grief where the individual is completely blown away by what has occurred. The loss is so significant, so apocalyptic, that the individual has a very difficult time ever recovering from the type of things the individual has seen in the war and the end results, the significant losses that have occurred because of it. So we've done previous videos on traumatic grief as well as just war theory on war itself. And this is prompted more so because of the recent war in Europe and because there's going to be a lot of individuals who are going to be suffering from this war as more refugees from Ukraine pour into Western Europe and the United States itself. And God forbid if the war was to spread. So as I said, war and traumatic loss are uniquely tied together. The trauma that is experienced is something that human beings should not have to witness, should not have to endure. But these horrible losses are so vivid and imprinting that the individual has a very hard time processing the loss itself. So in this, we see multiple loss of loved ones, which in itself can cause a complication in the grieving process. Losing one's son or daughter, or losing one's parents. And the loved ones don't have to be just immediate family. It could be aunts, uncles, grandparents. It could even be the loss of a pet. Loss of self also occurs, maybe physical self. Someone is permanently injured, or someone suffers mentally to the point where they lose who they are, what they represent. And this is very easy to occur because in war, there is also a loss of one's home, there's displacement, there's loss of finances, a loss of one's community itself. One's very community may no longer exist when they return due to a bomb that went off from aerial bombardment. And this is very true in Ukraine at the moment. Also, for some, there's a loss of freedom. Maybe they're captured, or maybe the country loses its independence, which is something that we don't even want to think about as Russia continues to invade Ukraine. But many nations throughout the history of the world have lost their independence, and individuals, because of that, have lost their very freedom itself. So when it comes to traumatic grief and those who survive, the survivors of war, there are many things that obviously haunt and follow after the horrible incidents that they witness. PTSD is one that we will look at a little bit later as well. But these images continue to haunt the survivor. And Robert Lifton did extensive research on issues that continue to haunt the survivors themselves. And whenever we come upon something where there is a very large amount of death, insurmountable chaos, there usually is a death imprint of some type, followed with death anxiety. And in PTSD, the fragmented memory of the incident is so grotesque, so horrific, that it is unable to be processed properly, and it's fragmented in short term, and it continually is looking to find itself formatted within the long-term memory, but it's unable to find itself, the trauma, because the trauma is unresolved, and the individual was unable to cope with it at the moment because of the horrific nature of the loss. So after war, and many of these refugees who are going to flee after seeing their homes literally blown to pieces or their loved ones blown to pieces, there's going to be a severe death imprint on their psyche. And there's also going to be an anxiety that exists of fear of death. And this is especially true for many of the children who are going to witness haunting images that are occurring in Ukraine. Others, according to Lifton, will later experience what we refer to as survivor guilt. The individuals after the war might feel that a loved one passed away and they didn't, and they might feel guilty in regards to their own survival or what they had to do to survive. And this is the case in any type of situation of life and death, from school shootings to war zones such as Ukraine. Counterfeit nurturance is another term coined by Lifton, and this refers to a situation that occurs when an individual starts to lose interpersonal relationship abilities, to have trust, to have authenticity with another individual. There's always that feeling that something bad could occur, and the ability to form a more healthy, trusting, authentic relationship is not able to occur. Finally, according to Lifton, what's important is the formulation of the trauma. And this is how the fragmented images, the fragmented unresolved trauma is finally coded, finally processed within the long-term memory, and it finds a place within the overall narrative of the person's life. The loss, no matter how tragic, no matter how extreme, there is a new meaning moving forward from that particular loss. So is there a formulation? Some individuals may never formulate. They may fall down a deep road of despair, depression, suicide, drugs, and so forth. So these types of traumas that individuals should never be exposed to. These things happen during war, and it's happening in Ukraine as we speak. War-torn individuals, hence, witness some of the worst images that you could imagine, things that you would only think that were in a movie, multiple losses, and the intense trauma that comes from an unneeded, unfathomable, no explanation, evil that comes from another human being. So when it comes from a tsunami, this type of death and widespread destruction, it's almost easier to find some justice, to find some conclusion, closure. But when it happens due to someone who's evil, such as a school shooting, or an individual who rapes a woman, or in the case of Ukraine, Putin literally invading a sovereign nation and causing multiple war crimes to be thrown upon this peaceful nation, individuals just look around and they see neighbors dying in the street or dead already, not even being able to be buried because there's more bombs flying, individuals being kidnapped by soldiers or raped by other soldiers, children witnessing these things, seeing their home blown to pieces or a parent die. And this is coming from evil. It's coming from another human being. And this is very hard to process, to fathom, to understand. And this, again, imposes a very tragic death imprint upon the individual, where there will be death anxiety, future dread, survivor guilt, and of course, post-traumatic stress disorder. So these individuals are going to, these refugees for the most part, after they initially grieve, there's going to be a high percentage that are going to suffer from this. And this is why when they're initially rescued, the spiritual and the physical needs are being met with food, water, clothing, shelter. But the mental scars are going to be far lasting, well beyond the end of this war when it eventually does end. These individuals are going to be very depressed. There's going to be an emotional numbing, and especially, which is very worrisome is for children. Being exposed to this type of trauma at such a young age, they can have a numbing to this type of violence, to this type of effect, and it can stunt their emotional growth. Additionally, we list there will be a loss of identity. What is it to be, in the case of this war, a Ukrainian, or what is it to be a father or mother who lost a child because of this war, or vice versa? An identity of being a certain individual to the town that was just wiped off the map due to the inhumane bombing from the Russian Air Force. There can also be a loss of faith. How could a good God allow this to happen? Which will bring forth various existential questions of where was God during this? There might even be anger towards one's God or one's particular belief or defining belief that holds the world together. These individuals have lost everything. And if you can put yourself in their shoes and imagine having your family, some of them maybe murdered and killed, and your entire home and every belonging that you've ever collected blown up into a fiery ball of destruction, no longer present. And then you walk outside and maybe a store you went to is gone. Your neighbor's house is gone. And you're living now with this survival mode. There's going to be a lot of existential questions of why did this happen? And with that comes broken interpersonal skills, as we already referred to, as the counterfeit, as the counterfeit ability to formulate trusting relationships, as Lifton referred to, counterfeit nutrients. So these individuals, counterfeit nurturants. So these individuals are going to have very hard time with trust. They're going to have a very difficult time forming authentic relationships with others. And in it, there's going to be two other levels of interpersonal relationships. Those namely anger and revenge, and those of judgment and justice. And these are things that are going to be craving within certain individuals. And they're going to be demanding it. And it's something that has to be answered. And it's something that many within the Holocaust, and many who died during the Holocaust, they had a just anger. And after the war, part of their healing was bringing the Nazis to justice and judgment. And this was a very important part of their healing. So helping the individuals more than just physical, it also is mental help, acknowledgement of the loss, and various crisis intervention strategies, especially on the border. Some of these individuals are coming with nothing left, and they are in a state of numbness. They're in a state of shock. They might even be in a state of denial. They might even be suicidal. So there's a situation where crisis intervention must be employed to see where these individuals are, to understand where this individual mentally is, emotionally is, how well are they coping with the unbelievable thing that just happened that would numb any of us. So crisis intervention is key in determining who is coping and who isn't. Long-term treatment of complicated grief, obviously. There's going to be prolonged grief disorder or depression, suicidal ideation, obviously. Many of these individuals won't be able to move on. Maybe they can't go back. Maybe they need to go and start anew. So how do they formulate? How do they readjust in society? Is it a new story in the United States or Western Europe, or do they return? What is their survivor mission? And this is one of the biggest things with any traumatic happening. Individuals who maybe are raped, they go forth with a survivor mission to not only become stronger, but to help protect other individuals who are raped, or individuals who suffer at the hands of gun violence. They will look to make better gun laws, and it's their survivor mission. It's what pushes them forward. It's how they make sense of the nonsense that just occurred. They try to make good out of the bad that occurred. And the survivor mission is already implemented very much in Ukraine, preserving Ukrainian identity, preserving Ukrainian independence. That's very much a survivor mission. And that's the pride, the collective pride that they're taking together. And this is why they're so successfully standing up to one of the greatest bullies of so far of the 21st century, Vladimir Putin, and the second largest military in the world. There are also social implications beyond the individual, displacement. And within this displacement, we see over now at this early phase in the war, 1 month in, already 10 million displaced refugees, and those who haven't left, those individuals who are staying, that have no home, that live in shelters within the city itself. Then there's also the social implication on everyone else, this war immersion, as it's referred to as. Everyone is getting these death imprints on the news broadcasts, whatever channel you're tuning into. You see the constant death, dead soldiers, destroyed cities, individuals who maybe have lost a limb, individuals on the border crying about the loss of a loved one. And we are becoming immersed into this, even though we're not on the front line. So these images keep pouring in, and they keep reminding us of the sorrow of others, especially those of us who are empathetic. And it also reminds us that nuclear holocaust is now again a possibility, something that the Cold War brought an end to. And it appears now that it's again a possibility. And when that wakes up many for others that lived during the Cold War, new trauma, and it also creates new trauma for this new generation as well as fear that our own cities might be struck, or that we will send our children to war itself, to go and fight against Putin and his ideas of controlling and dominating the world. So that's a fear everyone has. Now, socially also is the fact that there's no burial taking place. The norms of society have, due to war, socially have not been able to be carried out. When someone dies, they are buried. There's a funeral. These things are not occurring. So socially, the collective consciousness of the war-torn area is being left without closure. One's body is being buried in a backyard, maybe, or they're being left on a street and no bodies are being picked up. Some cemeteries are overfilled and no individuals can be properly cremated or buried. And this is leaving one to an inability to find closure, but also creating images so terrifying for young children and adults alike, witnessing this carnage. And the fact that there isn't a social norm to conclude this only adds to the trauma and the grief itself. So helping at an individual level, we discussed, how do you help at a social level? Well, the first thing is there's a tendency to try to minimize or deny, and that impedes aid. So realism in action is needed. What we refer to as the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. And corporal works of mercy are merely helping others with food, water, clothing, shelter, supplying these needs. Or if you can't do that financially, giving aid that is needed. Spiritual works of mercy, praying for the oppressed, praying for peace, sending religious items, helping others and counseling others through their grief and pain on the front line, or for refugees who come. Another thing is respecting human dignity and care for the most vulnerable. When it comes to wars like this, it's usually the poor and the elderly that are ones that are first struck. They're the ones that don't have the financial capabilities to escape. So we have to look out for the marginalized in society and make sure that they and their needs are met. Also, beyond that, dismissing any type of classism or racism. And we've seen a little of that in the past. I mean, just because this is a European war, we tend to sometimes dismiss other wars, such as the war in Syria. And we saw how Syrian refugees weren't as granted as open access as many of the Ukrainians are. And there is a type of attitude where Europeans will help Europeans, or Middle Easterns will help Middle Easterns. And you get this attitude where certain individuals get more help than others. So when it comes at a social level, these ideas of classism, racism, cultural differences need to be dismissed in the treatment of individuals who need help. Government and individuals working together. The government has already began to help Ukraine militarily, but also has opened up many venues on ways to help Ukraine through various financial and physical ways, health ways, medical ways. You can also do that through various Ukrainian churches, Ukrainian Catholic as well as Ukrainian Orthodox churches, or any other type of faith that you belong to. It doesn't have to be part of a Christian faith to be able to help and work together to help support these individuals who have suffered so much. Finally, the final two things that have to be really ensured at the social level is finally getting these individuals some closure with burial and help in the rebuilding process. And that day will eventually come. All wars eventually end. When, we can't say, but being able to help these individuals at a social level, cleaning up, rebuilding, and finding closure with their loved ones, giving them the human dignity and respect that the dead deserve, which has not been granted. And that's for soldiers and civilians alike. And then ensuring justice against war crimes. Any war crimes that were committed, there has to be equal prosecution and sanctions in whichever way possible to make sure Putin never again is able to live a normal life, for he is a criminal, and any soldiers or any officials in Russia that have carried out these war crimes, that they are never able to look themselves in the mirror as a good person, but to be held over with this guilt, and that punishment will come in this world or the next. And obviously for victims, it's better that it comes in this world so that at least they can see some type of healing. And sometimes that's difficult to do, especially when a nation that has committed the war crimes has a nuclear option and you're unable to have a complete unconditional surrender situation to bring that justice. We offer at AIHCP a grief counseling certification. It's a 4-year certification. So you take 4 independent courses, and that leads to the 4-year certification. You can go at your own speed, your own pace. So qualified professionals are more than welcome to take the courses and earn this certification. And with so much grief in the world, licensed professionals might want to learn a little bit more about grief and be able more equipped on their academic resume to offer this type of help. We have our phone number below at 330-652-7776. And we also have our email at info@aihcp.org. Behind me is a link to our page. So in the meantime, please pray and whatever way you can support Ukraine, and understand that this war is going to produce many grotesque and evil images. And it's going to affect not just those in Ukraine, but those far away in terms of the images that are coming. Hopefully the war ends soon. And hopefully one day we as a society can just totally and completely say goodbye to war and not ever have to see one occur on this planet again because of the viciousness that we see as its result. And we see it in the eyes of the refugees from Ukraine. I'd like to thank you for listening and have a good day.